Hello students. In the last presentation, I have discussed with you people the psychodynamic approach. In today's presentation, I will be covering post-Freudian approach, under which I will discuss about Carl Jung, Karen Horney, Alfred Adler, Erich Fromm, and Erik Erikson. Moving on to behavioral approach and last cultural approach. Post-Freudian approaches. So this post-Freudian approaches, it is also known as neo-Freudian approach. Alright, so this approach is also known as the neo-analytic or post-Freudian approach because these psychologists were after Freud. So although they were followers of Freud, but they disagreed with certain concepts of Freud. Particularly, like Freud talked about the concept of id as important for personality. The neo-Freudians talked about the concept of ego. So Freud talked about the concept of unconscious as a very important determinant for personality, whereas Neo-Freudians they focused on the conscious aspect of the personality. Freud talked about sexual instincts, whereas Neo-Freudians talked about the social-cultural instincts, along which they emphasized on the features of creativity and problem solving. Okay, so a number of theories developed their ideas following Freud, but then these theories are less characteristics of sexual and aggressive tendencies of the id and the expansion of the concept of ego. So the human qualities of creativity, competence, and problem-solving abilities were basically emphasized. Now let's start with the first neo-Freudian, who was Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Jung. He focused on aims and aspirations. So his theory is also known as analytical psychology. Analytical particularly means here the opposites. So Carl Jung talked about the balance of two opposite forces into the personality. And here he focused on particularly the collective unconscious, unlike Freud, where Freud focused on personal unconscious, that is my own unconscious personality, whereas Carl Jung said that the unconscious unconscious transmits across generations. And how do we get to know that? We are aware of that by looking at a concept known as the primordial images. I will talk about it later, but first let us see what Carl Jung have to say. So according to Carl Jung, man has developed consciousness slowly and laboriously in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state. And this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness. So as Carl Jung talked about personal unconscious, according to Carl Jung, there are certain events of which we have not consciously taken note. They have remained, so to speak, below the threshold of consciousness. They have happened, but they have been absorbed subliminally. Now, what do you mean by subliminally? Subliminal means below the threshold. And here, subliminal also means that the content which the ego rejects. So there are certain events which is being followed by the ego which is the reality principle, whether it will accept the event or it will reject the event, and accordingly ego will transfer it to the personal unconscious. There are certain complexes as we have come across. There, according to Sigmund Freud, it was Oedipus complex. According to Alfred Adler, it is inferiority complex, and according to Carl Jung, complexes populate the personal unconscious. So personalities which have the potential to exert a powerful control over one's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors was what complexes meant according to Carl Jung. Now, one interesting and important feature of the personal unconscious is that groups of contents may come together to form a cluster or constellation. So Jung called them complexes. When we say a person has a complex, we mean he or she is strongly preoccupied by something that he or she can hardly think about anything else. So in modern parlance, he has a hang up. So a strong complex is easily noticed by others, although the person himself may not be aware of it. From the unconscious there emanate determining influences which, independently of tradition, guarantee in every single individual a similarity and even a sameness of experience and also of the way it is represented imaginatively. One of the main proofs of this is the almost universal parallelism between mythological motifs. So here, personal unconscious is composed of elements from one's individual experience, that means one's own experience, and collective unconscious is composed of elements which are being inherited and which all humans share. So collective unconscious we can also find in the unconscious qualities that are not individually acquired but are inherited. For example, instincts as impulses to carry out actions from necessity without conscious motivation. So in this deeper stratum we find archetypes. The instincts and archetypes together form the collective unconscious. And Jung, this was as per Jung's dialogue. So according to Jung, he said that I call them collective because unlike the personal unconscious, it is not made up of individual and more or less unique contents but of those which are universal and of regular occurrence. Now we got the term archetypes. So archetypes are cognitive categories or predispositions that humans are born with to think, feel, perceive and act in specific ways. And archetypes, these are actually the archaic heritage of humanity. So archetypes cannot be perceived directly. Their existence can be recognized only through the images or symbols which arise from them. Okay, so the influence of archetypes, it possesses the capacity to initiate, control and mediate the common behavioral characteristics and typical experiences of all human beings. Thus, on appropriate occasions, archetypes give rise to similar thoughts, images, mythologisms, feelings, and ideas in people, irrespective of their class, creed, race, geographical location, or historical epoch. This was said according to Anthony Stevens. Now, most common archetypes are that of mother, birth, death, rebirth, power, the hero, child. So these are most common archetypes. This is common and we can find in like every individual have an idea about all this, isn't it? Which is common. It is not that this comes under the collective unconscious also, which as we know that it forms with archetypes as well. So it is not of the individual experience, it's not personal experience for most of them. Okay, so there are as many archetypes as there are typical situations in life, and endless repetition has engraved these experiences into our psychic constitution. So not only in the forms of images filled with content but at first only as forms without content, representing merely the possibility of a certain type of perception and action. So the evolutionary basis of archetypes, just as the human body represents a whole museum of organs, each with a long evolutionary history behind it, so we should expect to find that the mind is organized in a similar way. It can no more be a product without history than is the body in which it exists. By history, according to Carl Jung, he doesn't mean that the fact that the mind builds itself up by conscious reference to the past through language and other cultural traditions. Carl Jung referred to the biological, prehistoric, and unconscious development of the mind in archaic man whose psyche was still close to that of the animal. For the sake of mental stability and even physiological health, the unconscious and the conscious must be integrally connected and thus move on parallel lines. Now, if they are split apart or dissociated, psychological disturbance follows. And about this, we will talk about it when we reach the disorders. Okay, remember this part. The second neo-Freudian was Karen Horney. Karen Horney basically disagreed with Freud from his perspective of females. She was another disciple of Freud who derived her theory further from Freudian principles. Karen Horney said that the difference between the two genders is primarily cultural. It is what society grooms females as. That means both the genders cannot be superior or inferior as against the other. It is primarily what society teaches females to be. So here Karen Horney talked about very optimistic view of human nature, unlike Freud, who talked about human nature as a very pessimistic or a negative approach. Now here she emphasized also on the aspect of self-actualization and the aspect of growth. Same thing we'll be talking about a little later in detail also. Now here she also said that personality is a resultant from a disturbed interpersonal relationship, and in fact that can lead to many mental illnesses and disorders. Now interpersonal relations, basically she focused on parent-child interaction. For instance, a parent is very discouraging, very indifferent towards the child, so a child will have an impact on the personality because the child will become very insecure, and that is what Karen Horney called as the basic anxiety. Now, this develops during childhood where children, when they do not get a very supportive environment, very warm environment in the family, they develop a basic anxiety which later results in disorders. So by providing this kind of behavior, parents can generate among children feelings of isolation and helplessness which interfere with healthy environment or healthy development. Next, we have Alfred Adler, who focused on lifestyle and social interest. So he basically focused on individual psychology. Individual particularly because his main focus was on everybody's life goals, everybody's aspirations. So each individual has a purpose of life, a goal which motivates him, which provides him a support system which he works for. So every individual also has a concept of superiority or a concept of inferiority. Inferiority simple as shame, embarrassment, guilt, rejection. Now a lot of times when we look at people who are having some kind of handicap, for instance, somebody having a vision handicap cannot see, so that particular person will compensate for that inferiority through other sense organs. So in this case, the sense organ of touch will be very good for this person for compensating for the vision loss. Now, that is what Adler called as overcoming that inferiority complex and developing a superiority about yourself. He also discussed the behavior in general as very purposeful and goal directed. So every behavior has to have a purpose. It is not random, and a purpose is to fulfill the life goal towards which everybody's lifestyle is built. So he believed human beings are social beings and psychological qualities such as growth and realization resulted from desire of freedom and striving for justice or truth. Next, we have Erich Fromm, and he had the human concerns. Now, Erich Fromm was particularly focusing on social and cultural aspects of personality. So he said that the cultural elements or the cultural values like freedom, justice, responsibility, all of these needs results in a healthy personality. So he focused on cultural influence on the person and the person's influence on the culture in the vicious cycle where both of them equally influence each other in developing a healthy personality. So he obviously considered human beings as very social beings who are more oriented towards love for themselves and for other beings, and their characteristics develop from their social experience. So Fromm holds that character traits, that is personality, develop from our experiences with other individuals. While culture is shaped by the mode of existence of a given society, people's dominant character traits in a given society work as forces in shaping the social processes and the culture itself. So his work recognizes the value of positive qualities such as tenderness and love in personality development. Now let's move on to the last neo-Freudian, who was Erik Erikson, search for identity. So Erikson was very influenced by Freud, particularly the stages of development. So Erikson talked about the psychosocial stages of development, where he talked about 8 stages. Now development here means right from infancy to old age. Okay, so he covered infancy, early childhood, play age, school age, adolescence, early adulthood, middle age, and old age, where he tried to introduce the two opposites, where one has the positive stage and the other one has the negative aspect. Now, whenever anybody is developing, the person might be developing the positive aspect, another person might be developing negative aspect. Now, particular focus for Erikson was on adolescence. So, for instance, the concept of identity and the concept of identity crisis. So, a healthy identity versus a crisis identity, that is what Erikson talked about. Now, one more aspect which Erikson focused was that development is a lifelong process, and therefore we need to consider it in these particular stages. And unlike Freud, his emphasis was on rational, conscious, and ego related processes. So Erikson argues that young people must generate for themselves a central perspective and a direction that can give them a meaningful sense of unity and purpose. Now let's move on after covering these 5 neo-Freudians to the criticism of psychodynamic theory. Now this particular theory was criticized a lot in terms of certain characteristics. Let's look at that. Number 1, they are largely based on case studies and lack by a rigorous scientific basis. So based on selective case studies and lacking of rigorous scientific basis, this basically presumes that Freud was only considering few cases where from those particular cases he developed and formulated the theory. Now since those cases were limited in number, and those cases were not scientifically tested, that remains the biggest criticism for Freud. Number two, small and atypical individuals were taken as samples for advancing generalizations. Now here again, if Freud was using very limited number of data and particular kind of individuals who are atypical, having certain set of characteristics, that means, and then he generalized those to the population again, that was considered unjustified. Number three, concepts are not properly defined and it is difficult to submit them to scientific testing. Now a concept like unconscious, a concept like progression, a concept like displacement, these concepts were not very clearly defined. For a layman to hear a concept like ego, it will be very confusing because the person will confuse it with the normal everyday concept of ego. So such concepts were very confusing and not accurately defined as per the critics. Number 4, Freud has used males as the prototype of all human personality development. He overlooked female experiences and perspectives. Now this has been the major criticism of this theory. His own daughter criticized him for this, that why are you only looking at one particular gender and then you're applying it the same to all the genders, which is not fair again. So with that, we wind up the criticism of Freud's theory. Now let's move on to the behavioral approach. So behavior, as we know, is any reaction or any response to an outside stimulus. Now this theory particularly talks about a stimulus or another stimulus or stimulus response. So it can be SS conditioning, which we call as the classical conditioning by Pavlov. Before moving on, the behavioral approach does not give importance to the internal dynamics of behavior. Okay, so the behaviorists believe in data which they feel are definable, observable, and measurable. So the theory focuses on study of stimulus response and reinforcements. And personality can be best understood as a response of an individual to the environment. They see the development as a change in response characteristics, that is, person learns new behaviors in response to new environments and stimuli. So when we talk about classical conditioning, Pavlov have talked about the association between two stimulus. For instance, a normal response for a dog looking at food or hearing about food will be to salivate. That's one stimulus. The other stimulus, suppose light blinks and then food is given. So one stimulus. And the other stimulus, that is classical conditioning. The second part of it is operant conditioning given by Skinner, where he basically focused on the concept of reward and punishment. Reward was used in the concept of reinforcement, where a particular behavior has a higher probability of getting repeated in the future. So that is reinforcement. For instance, a particular child is told by the mother that if you do your homework, you will be allowed to go out and play. So his chances of doing the homework increases in future because he knows that if he does his work on time, he will be allowed to go out and play. That is operant conditioning, where the person operates on the environment, where the person influences the environment. Okay. The third aspect of behavioral approach is talking about the social learning theory, which basically deals with the role models. Now, these role models inspire the person to behave in certain ways. This theory is given by Albert Bandura. So for most behaviorists, the structural learning principles that involve the use of stimuli responses, and reinforcement in different ways. As we have already discussed about the classical conditioning, the operant conditioning, and the social learning theory. So the principles of these theories have been widely used in developing personality theories. So each response is a behavior which is emitted to satisfy a specific need. Thus, the core tendency that organizes behavior is the reduction of biological or social needs that energizes behavior. So the theory particularly, in order to understand, we also try and influence the aspect of scientific measurement because behaviorists talked about behavior should be observable, measurable, and scientific. Only then it can be considered in this study. Moving on to the last approach is the cultural approach. It is a very simple approach talking about how a particular culture, lifestyle, rituals, values, ceremonies influences your behavior. So this approach attempts to understand personality in relation to the features of ecological and cultural environment. People develop various personality qualities in an attempt to a culture or ecological features of groups in life. For example, people who live in forest and mountainous regions live with hunting and gathering as their primary means of livelihood. Here an example has been given of a tribal group from Jharkhand known as the Birhor. They represent such a population. Most of them live a nomadic life. In the Birhor society, children from an early age are allowed enormous freedom to move into forest and learning hunting and gathering skills. Now their child socialization practices are also aimed at making children independent. So to do many things without help from elders, autonomous, that is to take several decisions for themselves, and achievement oriented, that is accept risks and challenges such as those involved in hunting from an early age of life. Whereas in agricultural societies, children are socialized to be obedient to elders, nurturing to youngsters, and responsible to their duties. Since these behavioral qualities make people more functional in agricultural societies, they become dominant features of people's personality in contrast to independence, autonomy, and achievement, which are more functional and thus highly valued in hunting gathering societies. Because of different economic pursuits and cultural demands, children in hunting gathering and agricultural societies develop and display different personality patterns. So we compare these two behaviors here with that of industrial and agricultural behaviors. Okay, and we have come to understand that industrial societies results in a socialization in which children are very independent, they are very achievement oriented, whereas the other agricultural is a more dependent culture. So every culture has a certain style of grooming people, and this is what we consider in the cultural approach. Therefore, the cultural approach considers personality as an adaptation of individuals or groups to the demands of ecology or culture. Okay, so through this, today we have covered the neo-Freudian approaches, then we have covered the behavioral approach, and finally we have covered the cultural approach.